Sport in the olden days was really, really weird. I'm sure there's the case for sport in the current day, it'll seem weird in 100 years' time, but there is this additional level of strangeness. The incomprehensibility is compounded by only having really old footage or newspaper reporting to go off. It is only because of these sources that we can say sport was played at a level somewhat comparable to the modern day. But do these titles share the same weight? I think it's questionable. The weirdest of the weirdest, though, is what was each sport's founding years like. This may have to be a whole series into and of itself, because honestly, so much of it is nuts. So many bizarre and hilarious stories. And that is how this story and this series gets underway. The story starts with the man who founded the sport that this club plays, Thomas Wentworth Wills, the founder of Australian football. He was there upon the foundation of one of its most successful football clubs. Geelong the city was no stranger to football before Geelong the Football Club was founded. The Geelong Advertiser reported of the occurrence of football being played in April and May of 1859. What football meant in these times, though, is debatable. There were a lot of trial matches of Wills' former football, including a few that predate the Melbourne High and Scotch grammar game. The Melbourne Football Club was formed in 1858, but I'm not talking about them. That would make the story a bit more depressing. This is the story of Geelong. Upon the recommendation of Wells, the Geelong Football Club was founded as part of the effort to grow this new game of football in country Victoria. That Geelong would turn into quite the successful organisation. This is how every premiership this club has ever won was won, and how they all hold the same theme: denied any sort of real competitive fairness, detested by many of the big wigs and know-it-alls, and yet destined to go on and defy all obstacles and all doubters.
Come on, the Cats. Come on, the Cats. Let's show them all the way our team can play. For we are Geelong. Let's show them we belong with the greatest sides that ever played the game. So come on, the Cats. Come on, the Cats. We're proud of the blue and white. We're proud of our name. We'll fight for the right to win. That's the name of our game. We'll fight for the right to win. That's the name of our game.
This is part 1 of the story of all 17 Geelong seniors premierships, not the 10v/AFL premierships. We'll get to those, but Cardinia Park's premiership stand lists 7 additional years, and this is what we'll discuss right here and right now. In July 1859, an attempt is being made to establish a football club in Geelong, in what was attempted to be the Geelong equivalent of Melbourne, in order to fill up the void of outdoor sports by the absence of the cricket season. Back in the day, your choices was really nothing and alcoholism. The Geelong Football Club was formed in 1859. In the early days of footy, teams organised games on a short time span, and teams basically wore different jumpers week in, week out. By 1875, teams realised this was not the best way to do it. Geelong had worn all white since 1872, but beginning in 1876, Geelong wore these blue and white hoops. White and blue had been worn by the club through most of its history to this point, and in all likelihood, the blue hoops on the first jumpers would have been painted on. There have been many variations, but if we use the very broad title of alternating blue and white hoops, we can say Geelong have the longest standing jumper design in the now Australian Football League. The following year, 1877, was an important year for the sport of Australian football. The laws of the game had been codified back in 1859, a few years ahead of association football and rugby football doing the same thing. The closest thing to the Premiership was the Challenge Cup. That was the name of multiple trophies. The Catalonian Society Challenge Cup was the first, and it was won by Geelong in every edition it was played for. Many of these Challenge Cups were won questionably, thanks to the weirdness of sport in its early days. One of the trophies got lost and turned up in England somehow, but it was clear the game needed something better. It needed a governing body to resolve disputes between clubs, and the Victorian Football Association came along. Remarkably, despite Melbourne being the birthplace of the game, The South Australians actually narrowly beat the Victorians to creating a governing body within their state. The South Australian Football Association, which we now know as the SANFL, beat the VFA into existence by 3 days. And silly me thought this state's sporting incompetence was just a product of the modern day. Geelong was among the first 6 clubs to join this organisation. The other 5 were Albert Park, Carlton, Hotham, now North Melbourne, Melbourne, and St Kilda, but these seasons were still a mess. While the creation of the VFA was a step in the right direction, which had been much wanted for years, the clubs weren't ready to give up all control just yet. There was no set number of games a team played, and I mean that. The fixturing was not a thing that the VFA did. The fixturing was literally decided by the secretary of each club, and the league ladder was sorted by least losses and not most wins or win percentage or any sort of premiership point system. I know, bizarre. It was a bit mad, and as far as the standings were concerned, a win over a strong side based within Melbourne was the same as winning over Panera-bred football club from the country. This caused a problem for Geelong. In the modern day, you can frame Geelong as among the 10 Victorian clubs or the 9 non-Melbourne clubs, depending on what best suits your argument. And at the time, Geelong were definitely seen as non-Melbourne, at least by those in Melbourne. For 1877, Geelong were not a senior team, despite being a founding member of the association, but they got that status for 1878. But the Melbourne teams were doubting Geelong. They were far and away the best team outside of Melbourne, and backed up their claim of being the best team in all of Victoria by winning 4 matches against senior opposition. But as far as Melburnians were concerned, Geelong still needed to prove itself, and while most clubs outside of Melbourne weren't very good, they weren't all awful. Through its early days, Geelong had a fierce rivalry with Barwon, and I mean fierce. In an 1878 game between the two sides, up to half-time, the play had been unnecessarily rough, and as soon as it was stopped, a tremendous crowd of Barwon supporters surrounded Watson, who had worked hard for Geelong, and had given his opponent some severe falls. They threw eggs and turf at him, and the police had to protect him from the infuriated people. Just 10 minutes before the end of the game, a tackle which sent Barwon's captain into a somersault and falling with great force on his shoulder and neck prompted a fight on field joined by spectators. Judging from the flourishing of walking sticks in the air and the rapid flying about of hats, the atmosphere must have been remarkably warm. This was what the Geelong Advertiser reported on the match. After the lapse of 5 minutes, Watson was escorted to a cab by 4 policemen who had difficulty in keeping a mob of roughs from beating him, and then the player named seized the reins and drove through the crowd across the ground under a heavy fire of eggs, turf, stones, etc. Violence seems to be a common thing in sport in the 1800s. There was a high level of violence. A lot of sports saw deaths in its early years, and other just wild things going on. At least Geelong never had to deal with lunatics making their way onto a footy ground ever again. But for that 1878 Geelong team, the 4 senior wins and undefeated record, conceding merely 11 goals through 17 matches, was not enough. Melbourne, the best of the city clubs, would welcome Geelong to the MCG for a match that nominally, though to be clear not officially, was being played to decide the 1878 Premiership. Not a true grand final, especially in the modern sense, but it was basically one. A crowd of nearly 10,000 came to watch the match. Geelong chose to kick to the Jollymont end. The Geelong players were gaining an early ascendancy, with the first score of the game going to Geelong a rush behind. After about 7 minutes of fast play, it was Melbourne the team that would kick the first goal of the day. Di-Mauro of Geelong was playing a good game, and a pass to Booth saw him kick Geelong's first. Geelong dominated most of the half. Games were played in half in these days, but could not find a second major. In fact, Booth marked the ball before the end of the half, but because he didn't get his kick in time, before time expired, and under the laws at the time, the ball became dead and he would not get a kick. The kick after the siren would not be a thing for another 10 years. At half-time, Geelong were 1-7 to Melbourne's 1-1, so a 6-point lead to Geelong, right? Wrong! You clearly haven't been following along. Not only was there no modern scoring system, there was hardly anything modern in 1878, behinds, while counted, did not count, in the sense that you could kick 1 or 20 more behinds than your opposition. Only goals count with regards to the score. So basically, at halftime in this game, it was all level. After the interval, Melbourne got to the better start, kicking 3 behinds in the first 5 minutes, which again doesn't mean really anything. But after this, it seemed for Melbourne it was impossible to get the ball past halfway for most of the second half. Booth kicked 2 goals in the second half to end the game, with a game-high 3. An additional goal from Christie and from Douglas off a set shot moments after a miss saw Geelong run away from Melbourne in a fine victory. Peter Pinder wrote in the Australasian that Geelong in 1878 weren't as good as they were in 1877. Remember, they weren't a seniors team at that point in the VFA, but the pivot furnishes not only the best team in the colony, but also the best provincial team. I need to know 2 things here. First, the use of the word pivot. Around the 1860s, Geelong developed the nickname Pivot City, due to Geelong being the central hub for shipping and rail to Melbourne, Ballarat and the Western District. In fact, the football club was nicknamed the Pivotonians, basically the people from the pivot. A very Houston Texans style name, if you will, for its early history after initially being nicknamed the Seagulls. Speaking of seagulls, the Geelong jumper is said to represent the blue water and the white seagulls of the Corio Bay, but that is in all likelihood something that was come up with far after that jumper design was first worn. But secondly, if you thought the way that was phrased was a bit weird, the pivot furnishing, this is how that exact article by Pinder ends. This concludes our intercourse for the present, my worthy knights of leather, and I shall therefore retire for the next few months to other scenes and new pursuits, which he puts in quotes, and I only hope these will prove as pleasant and as interesting to me as the football season of 1878. Well, clearly there's nothing else interesting going on, so it's time to talk 1879. Before we go on, I feel like it's important to know how these flags were actually handed out. There won't be another Premiership deciding game in Victoria until South Melbourne lose to Collingwood in 1896. These premierships are a matter of opinion, really. Tables were listed in newspaper articles at season's end, sorted by least games lost, but as seen here in the football record, eventually the top 3 would be considered official, including seasons that predate the VFA, trying to note the VFL's existence back to 1870, despite the fact that league was a breakaway due to the money greed, or lusty D's, as I'm sure Pinder would put it, from the 6 clubs that were Melbourne, South Melbourne, Collingwood, Essendon, Fitzroy and Geelong. But for 1879, as a result of Geelong's win over Melbourne, the number of games against senior opposition increased from 4, excluding the Premiership decider, to 9. Pinder wrote at the conclusion of 1879, the football season of this year of grace, like many another season past, has had its day and ceased to be the game with all the bustle and excitement its contest, full of lusty life, I told you he'd use that, is for the time consigned to memory domain. I have no idea who this was, in fact. It's not the satirical English writer John Walcott, who wrote under the pseudonym of Peter Pinder, because he died just less than 50 years before the founding of the Geelong Football Club, but I need to know, his writing is so funny. But back to Geelong now. Those matches were 2 against Carlton, 2 against Melbourne, 2 against Hotham, who remember are now North Melbourne, and 1 each against Melbourne, Essendon and West Melbourne. Geelong won every game except for the game against West Melbourne, which was called a draw by arrangement on account of the rain. Imagine paying your good money to see the best football team on the planet in what, remember, was a usually pretty ugly spectacle, only for it to be rained away. But look at these other games. A Ballarat combined team twice against the Geelong Public Schools, sure. But here are 4 teams. Geelong all played once. These are very interesting to me. Victorian, Port Adelaide, Norwood and South Australia. The first 3 are SA clubs. They're members of the then South Australian Football Association. I had no idea at the time you could just play a team in another state and count it in your own league. And does this SA mean the SA state team? I'm sorry, I thought adding these flags to the AFL tally was a bad idea beforehand, but the team, I'm pretty sure, played the SA state team. And clubs in what is now the SANFL, and a public schools team while we're at it. These flags barely count, but they were won, and they were captained in the first 2 by James Wilson. I couldn't find much information on basically any of the individual people to this story, to my disappointment, but the Wilsons are a fun story. James Wilson, who played for Geelong, had a father, also named James Wilson, who trained 2 Melbourne Cup winners in 1873 and 1876. The 1873 edition was won by Don Juan, and quickly became controversial over allegations the horse was a year older than he really was, and that he may have even been swapped for a better horse. those allegations were never proven. The man who wrote him that day was William Watson, the younger son of James Sr. and the younger brother of James Jr. His birthday is listed simply as 1859, which would have made him 13 or 14 at the time of the 1873 Melbourne Cup. Watson Sr., often referred to as Old Jim, was the president of the Geelong Football Club from 1878 to 1883. Wilson Jr., often referred to as Young Jim, was president from 1887 to 1888, having served as vice president and rode as a jockey in the 1870s, before Geelong's glory days. After his footy career, he would go to be a horse trainer himself. He won many notable races, including the 1899 Melbourne Cup and 2 VRC derbies. Dennis Pagan is the only other footy great to train a derby winner, and the Wilson brothers, as far as anyone can tell, are the only 2 men to win a top-level Australian football premiership and also win the Melbourne Cup.
Can you believe it's not the first time it's happened? I'm pretty sure it... James Wilson Jr., who captained Geelong to win its first 2 premierships in the VFA in 1878 and 79, went on to train the winner of the derby.
Well done, Danny Power, finding that.
This is the trajectory of the Geelong Football Club to this point. In 1878, Geelong played the 4 senior matches before playing for the premiership against Melbourne. In 1879, Geelong played 9, and in 1880, Geelong played 12. The percentage of Geelong's matches against senior opposition was 23.5 before playing Melbourne for the 1878 title. Since then, it has grown to 56.25% for 1879, and has grown again to 2/3 for 1880. Carlton had more of a claim to the premiership in 1880. The only match the two played was a 5-0 Carlton win. It was Geelong's first loss against senior VFA opposition ever. But for Carlton, their other match results were inferior to Geelong, resulting in Geelong winning another VFA premiership. The team at the beginning of the season was not very strong and did little more than hold its own towards the middle of the season, suffering a severe defeat, the first for 3 years, at the hands of Carlton. But Geelong's status as the best team in the colony grew and grew through the year. They defeated the South Australian-based Norwood 1-0 in a game during the season. Pinder noted how Geelong improved towards the end of the season, at which it was about the strongest of fields. He noted the names of Wilson, Watson, Douglas, Fairbairn, Shaw, Hall, Stephen, Morrison, Robertson, Murphy, Stedham, Pearson, Watt, DeLittle, and Christie as integral for Geelong. Watt was the leading goal kicker with 15 ahead of Douglas's 11. That's not all Pinder wrote, though. He began his article with, "The football season of 1880 has come and gone, and it behooves us," before consigning it to the region of forgetfulness to glance back over the leading incidences that have marked its course, as well as gather up the records of the various clubs into something like a complete form for helping and guidance in the time to come. Again, who the hell is this guy? I'd love to know. His articles have been a great joy to research, honestly. I need to know. It's not Walcott. Who is this Pinder guy? 1881 was not Geelong's year. It was still a good year for Geelong, though. 10 senior matches for 7 wins, 1 loss and 2 draws, but were ranked behind South Melbourne in their second season since South amalgamated with Albert Park, keeping the South Melbourne name but adopting Albert Park's red and white colour scheme. The annual Pinder article, information without which no understanding of this era of footy would be known, is not good. The microfilm version of this reference kept at the State Library of Victoria, seen here on the Trove Archives, is missing a whole section of the original article, which accounts for the information which is missing from the Wikipedia page and everything else. Look at this! Why? It is blocking the brilliant start to the article that has proved so much joy to me. The football season of this year of grace, with all its hope fulfilled or dreams dispelled, its stirring scenes and dougherty deeds, is numbered with the things that were, and once again devolves on what? Repeated tasks of glancing what? Varied course and putting in the incidences that marked its Tory? So basically, this is the best we get now. The Swans' first premiership is shrewd in the mystery of we actually have zero clue how many matches they have even played in. This hinders the South Melbourne claim to the premiership as well as something else, but I'll get to that at the end. We'll come back to that, Swans fans. You might not like what I have to say. At the end of 1882, the football season of this year of grace has come and gone. Its stirring scenes and dougherty deeds are numbered with the things that were its erstwhile heroes, have betaken them to fresh pursuits, and nothing now remains but to gather up its records in a compact form for present satisfaction and for useful reference in the time to come. If only he knew about his article from the year before. For 1882, there was some progress on the whole fair competition front. Melbourne played 16 senior matches, Essendon played 12, and Geelong played 13, as did South Melbourne, Carlton, and Hotham. Every team wants to score themselves and prevent the opponents from scoring themselves, and Geelong did so, kicking 120 goals and conceding only 19 over its 24 matches, only 11 of which were against non-senior opposition. Pinder wrote that Geelong undoubtedly claims pride of place this year, as on the analysis of the senior matches, it far outstrips all competitors, showing 10-1-2 matches, 1 loss drawn to the 5-2-5 of Essendon, the only club within cooey. God bless you, Pinder. You would have been so loved today if you probably weren't so white, and also you must be so dead. The only 2 defeats the club suffered were at the hands of Melbourne and Ballarat, the latter being more than counterbalanced by a win in the early part of the season. The club owes its position largely to its strong esprit de corps and splendid discipline, its members never sacrificing their club on the altar of individual glory, and the able way the team is handled, the captain never losing a point that is to be made. Geelong was a club right from the start, played as a team, and its players were praised for just that, playing for the team. The football season of this year of grace has gone to its rest. Its stirring incidences and its lusty acts are numbered with the things that were. The crowds that hung upon its thrilling scenes are scattered far and wide. The stalwart forms that fought the friendly fight have now betaken them to other aims and deeds. And once again the duty lies on me, before I make my parting bow, to summarise its features and its lessons, for pleasure in the present, and for profit, if it need be, in the days to come. I love this Pinder fellow so much. 1883 was described by Pinder as the most exciting season to date. The game was growing larger than Wills could ever have imagined. However, despite Pinder saying the duty lied on me to document the season for history's sake, his article does not have a table, so we turn instead to the Sportsman and an article written by the Goalpost. No, that's no lie. Anyway, Goalpost writes, the performances of the several senior clubs for the past season will be found in a tabulated form below, and it will be seen that Geelong has slightly the best of the average, but that of South Melbourne is almost as good, and as they beat Geelong in both of their 2 matches, their claim for the Premiership must be regarded as about equal. Those 2 by South Melbourne and the 1 by Carlton were the only losses Geelong had all season, but Geelong got the better of Carlton in the other 2 contests, but the good people at the Sportsman gave Geelong number 1. While the table for the premierships from 1877 to 1882 are going off Pinder's article in the Australasian, for the rest of the video, the table we're now considering official are going off Goalpost's article in the Sportsman. So we thank him very much for his service, if it wasn't also for the fact that he was also, must be, so dead. At any rate, this Geelong team was seriously a long way ahead of its opposition. 1884 proved that once again. Geelong lost on only 2 occasions, to South Ballarat, a country team, and Williamstown with a draw against Destined. They were the only matches the team did not win. Geelong played 2 matches against each of 7 senior teams, though the resentment for the team was still quite evident from the fact that only Williamstown, during their first season as a senior member of the VFL, played as few senior matches. They only played the 13. Despite a strong 1884, 1885 was a shocker of a year by Geelong 1870s and 1880s standards. They finished 3rd, the first time since becoming a senior VFA member did they finish outside the top 2. For 1886, the 2 sides at the top of the game were Geelong and South Melbourne. For those teams, the match that was seen as the match that very well could decide the Premiership was a match played at the South Melbourne Cricket Ground between the 2 sides on the 4th of September, dubbed the Match of the Century. 1886 saw many rule changes, among them the minimum size of the ground being 150 yards long and 100 yards wide, the umpires being mandatory rather than being optional, with the alternative being free kicks being called by captains, if you can imagine such a thing, and umpires to award a free kick when they saw an infringement rather than having to wait for an appeal cricket style. But the most notable was the introduction of quarters, with teams changing ends at the end of each quarter, so no more of this halves business. The Geelong Geelong side was the better team in the first quarter. They were the first to score, which came within the first minute. They outscored South Melbourne 8-1. Unfortunately for the spectators who had gathered in attendance, none of those were actually goals. 8 behinds to 1 at quarter time, which, remember, means the game is level at this point. I get the impression that some of these games were actually really awful to watch, but maybe I've spoken too soon, because Boyd kicked a goal from 40 yards out with a fine kick to give Geelong the first major of the day, and the only one to half-time. Geelong won 12 to 3 behinds. South Melbourne began the third quarter strongly, and sent the fans into real excitement when South Melbourne kicked their first goal to basically level the game. If South supporters were expecting the match to remain level, they were proven wrong quickly, as Geelong ended the third strongly, including a goal to lead 2-14 to 1-4. In the last quarter, except for the first few moments during which Harper scored a behind, Geelong never gave their opposition a show, and in the last 20 minutes, they did pretty much as they pleased. The result was Geelong 4 goals, 19 behinds, South Melbourne 1 goal, 5 behinds. The game showed that Geelong was undoubtedly the superior team. They won on the merits of the play and showed the most perfect form they have ever exhibited on a metropolitan football field. They played together with mechanical precision, and their coolness and quickness in eluding an opposition was first class. That result would ensure Geelong were the premiers again. In a 9-year period, Geelong won 7 premierships, twice back to back to back, in addition to 1886. While the premierships may seem like they were delved out somewhat aimlessly, because in part they were, the VFA did get their act together by creating a points-based system for 1888, which was scrapped for 1894 when finally every team played the same amount of games. If we use that proportional point system, Geelong was the deserving premiers every year, and in fact, listen to this, Swans fans, under the system, would have won the Premiership in 1881, the year South Melbourne won, despite the fact that today we don't have any idea of all the games they played. And South holds that advantage purely on head-to-head record. So I'm calling for change here. Geelong were the deserving premiers of that year. Sorry, Swans fans. You don't get to complain. You had Nick Davis once, and now we have to hear it every time the two sides play. And at least you won't pop up in this story at any point again. Hey, you didn't think to do one of these videos because that would have only required the one video, wouldn't it? This needs 5 parts. So, at any rate, despite the fact Geelong really should have 18 seniors premierships, this series continues with just the 17. I don't think I'm changing anything. But maybe Brian Cook, in part of all of his efforts to make these count as the AFL, despite the fact clubs play their say teams, maybe he can get around to giving Geelong that deserving 1881 title. For Geelong, this is a team that dominated its era in what was a much different game to the one today. 7 premierships in 9 years, and was arguably the best team in another year. This dispelled the notion that had been around since 1878 that they were a worser team based on their location. Geelong fans must have been so excited, so looking forward to 1887. Can't wait to see their team win another premiership. Oh, well. When I return, how the dominant team of the 1870s and 1880s lost its way, and how the Geelong Football Club found its groove again by giving itself sport's most unique identity, as they attempt to shut down one of Australia's football's grandest teams.